On Lectures in History, Emory University professor Patrick Allitt teaches a class about the California gold rush of the mid-1800s. He describes how people got there, the physical geography of the area, and the evolving technology used to mine gold. His class is about 50 minutes.
Good morning, everybody.
Morning.
The topic of our lecture today is the history of the gold rush, and I'm going to talk mainly about California in the years immediately following 1848. But gold's played a very, very important role in American history. If you think all the way back to the conquistadors, one of the things they were absolutely fascinated by was the quest for gold. And of course, the history of their conquest, first of the Aztecs and then of the Incas, is of an unquenchable desire for precious metals, gold above all, but also silver. Similarly, when the first English settlers came to Jamestown in 1607, what they were hoping to find was the same kind of supplies of gold that had been found by the Spaniards, and it was a source of bitter disappointment to them not to find gold in the what's now Virginia. They brought with them jewelers and goldsmiths. But America's first gold rush took place very close to where we are now in Georgia in 1829. This was the Georgia Gold Rush in North Georgia. And if you've been about 100 miles north of here, up to the town of Dahlonega, you'll have seen that the old Lumpkin County Courthouse has now been converted into a gold mining museum in Dahlonega itself. It's about 100 miles up the road. Now, what happened was that at first gold was discovered, and then suddenly people started pouring into the area in huge numbers because of the intoxicating possibility that gold would make them wealthy quickly. Until then, this had been an area really beyond the line of settlement, but suddenly now the white settlement catches up very quickly. And here's the governor, George Gilmer, describing what it was like meeting the Georgia miners in 1829. Many thousands of idle, profligate people flocked into Georgia from every point of the compass, whose pent-up, vicious propensities, when loosed from the restraints of law and public opinion, made them like the evil one, in other words, the devil, in his worst mood. After wading all day in the Etowah and Chattahoochee rivers, picking up particles of gold, they collected around light wood fires at night and played on the ground and on their hats, at cards, dice, pushpin and other games of chance for their day's findings. Whiskey carts served them too. Hundreds of combatants were sometimes seen at fisticuffs, swearing, striking and gouging eyes, as frontier men only can do these things. One of the ways in which frontiersmen, especially in the South, used to fight was until one of them had gouged out one of the eyes of his combatant. That was regarded as victory in one of these fights. Anyway, the army was sent in to restore some kind of order in this chaotic scene where people have poured in from every direction. And a major, they're here on the sheet which I gave you, the army major sent to keep order reported this: upwards of 200 persons who presented a most motley appearance of whites, Indians, half-breeds and Negroes, boys of 14 and old men of 70. And indeed their occupations appear to be as various as their complexions, comprising diggers, sawyers, shopkeepers, peddlers, thieves and gamblers. Besides them were also found in the hopeful assemblage 2 colonels of the Georgia militia, 2 candidates for the legislature and 2 ministers of the gospel, all no doubt attracted thither by the love of gold. So I think that he's making the most of it there with those lovely twos. But this was a very, very rich site of gold, and a large quantity of gold was drawn out of the mines there between 1829 and into the 1870s and 80s. For a while it was minted into federal currency. You can see the coin on the left is a United States of America coin. And on the right there, after the Confederate secession in 1861, the Confederate Bank also used Georgia gold for minting. And you've all, just by living here, you've all seen an example of Dahlonega gold down on the State Capitol building, 5 or 6 miles from here. The dome is thinly coated with Dahlonega gold. So this is a very, very important source. Now, the people who already lived there, who already lived in the area where the Georgia Gold Rush took place, were the Cherokees, one of the Native American societies. Ever since the American Revolution, the federal government had been trying very hard to integrate the Native American nations into the United States, saying, learn to become Christians, learn literacy, learn to become farmers instead of hunters and gatherers, become integrated into our society. Certainly that was the federal policy in the first 3 or 4 decades of the Republic. But now comes a test case. Now suddenly it turns out that the Cherokees are living on land for which the whites are very, very hungry indeed. What principle was going to prevail? Well, unfortunately, the principle of racial exclusion was going to prevail. The whites just wanted to get rid of the Indians one way or another. And in the election of 1828, which immediately preceded the Georgia Gold Rush, in their successful candidate, Andrew Jackson, they'd found somebody who also wanted to get rid of the Native Americans any way he could. This is John Ross, one of the Cherokee chiefs, and if any community of Native Americans had lived up to the hopes that the federal government had, it was clearly the Cherokees. They'd learned how to read. One of the missionaries had created a syllabary, that is a vocabulary, to enable them to write down the Cherokee language. The Bible had been translated into the Cherokee language. Many of them had become Christians. Many of them now wore American dress. This was a highly integrated community. But nevertheless, the principle prevailed, we've got to get rid of them. Congress actually passed the Indian Removal Act in 1830, which was signed by President Jackson, saying that the so-called 5 civilized tribes, this is President Jackson, and he said that the 5 civilized tribes should move from their current lands out onto a place that was then called Indian Territory. Now, the 5 groups they had in mind were the Creeks, Cherokees, Seminoles, Choctaws, and Chickasaws. And the idea was that there'd be a forcible resettlement of population on the other side of the Mississippi River out here. This is now Oklahoma, and it was then called Indian Territory. The Georgia state government passed a law specifying that the lands up in this northern tier of Georgia should be reallocated by a land lottery to white settlers. In other words, to forcibly dispossess the former inhabitants and hand it over to the whites instead. And so this is the prelude to a movement I'm sure you've all heard about, the Trail of Tears, by which the Cherokee were shifted and forced to migrate several hundred miles under very, very adverse conditions, with large numbers of them dying along the way. It's one of the great human rights violations of American history, and particularly in the history of the state of Georgia itself. Now, last time, in talking about the spread of American settlement and also the spread of American political power, we talked about the Mexican War. This was the war fought between Mexico and the United States in the years 1846 to 48. And as I said then, although the American armies were not particularly well led, they were much more effective than the Mexican armies, with the result that they were able to win a spectacular series of battlefield victories. And by late 1847, the leader of one of the American armies, General Winfield Scott, he landed on the eastern coast of Mexico at Veracruz, led his army inland, and they actually were able to overrun Mexico City itself. So on the right there, you can see a picture of General Scott's army marching triumphantly into Mexico City, where in effect they were able to dictate the terms of the peace treaty that followed. And this was the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. Whose geographical significance was that a vast area of Mexico was now handed over to the United States. Nearly all the land which currently comprises California, Nevada, Utah, Arizona, and then parts of New Mexico and Colorado. What's today the southwestern quarter of the United States. Now, certain things about it are important to remind you of. This is now an area with a high population, but then its population was extremely low. Only a few thousand Spaniards had ever actually lived there, or after 1821, a few thousand Mexicans. There was a low density of Native American settlement, but it was mainly unoccupied territory. And the reason it was unoccupied is because it's so dry. Nearly all this land has got very, very low rainfall, with a few exceptions, like in the northern California coast. Most of it's too dry for ordinary agriculture, so not many people could live there. Now, just to give you an idea of how low its population was, which of you has been to San Francisco? There we are. All right, and so you know it's a fantastic natural harbour. You sail in through the Golden Gate, which is a fairly narrow entrance, into an enormous deep water enclosed harbour. And now, of course, one of the great cities of the world is right there. But this is what it looked like in 1846 to 7. You can see here. Just a handful of huts and a few streets. It was a very, very quiet and sleepy little place. And its future significance was unimaginable at that time. Now, this is a settler. This is a man called Johann Sutter, and he lived at a place called Sutter's Fort, which is on the site of the current city of Sacramento. Sacramento is now the state capital of California. I mentioned in one of the previous lectures that Americans had been moving into Texas even when Texas was still a Mexican territory. And in the same way, American settlers had been moving into California even when it was still Mexican territory. One of them was Johann Sutter. He came originally from Switzerland, and he set up a trading fort. Now, and this is, there it is in the upper picture. The fact that, it's very different from a shop, and the fact that he had to have a fort is a sign of how politically volatile the area was. He was kind of expecting to be robbed or to be attacked, and so he took precautions against that. Now, he was at Sacramento, and one of the things he wanted to sell was lumber. But the lumber was going to come from up in the foothills of the Sierra Nevada mountains, which is east of Sacramento. And so he sent one of his assistants, a man called James Marshall, up the river, the American River, up to a place called Coloma, and asked him to design and build a sawmill. And this is at a place where the American River is flowing fast enough that the water can turn a water wheel, and the wheel is attached to circular saw blades, so the lumber could be brought there and sawn, and then sent further down the river to Sutter's Fort itself. And one of the things that you have to do to make an effective sawmill, again, we talked about this earlier in the course, is divert the river down the mill race. Can you picture this? A designed flume which carries water flowing fairly rapidly to turn the water wheel. Now, in the mill race there, he found little flakes of gold, little metal flakes. He reported back to Sutter, his boss, saying, "Found gold in the mill race." And Sutter said, "Don't tell anybody. We'll keep it secret." You know, they could foresee this was a great thing. But you know how bad everyone is at keeping secrets? Yeah? Don't you all know from your own experience that the only way to actually have a secret is to never tell anyone? Because somehow, as soon as you tell anybody, the secret gets out. And that's exactly what happened in this case. And it wasn't long before the news got back east, and in fact it spread very rapidly all over the world, with the result that a massive incursion of people into California began to take place. All right, now this is the area where the gold was discovered. This is Sacramento, and Sutter's Fort was right there. And he'd sent his assistant, Marshall, upriver, up the American River, to here, to a place called Coloma, and that's where the gold had been discovered. Now, we now know, from subsequent extensive geological work, that the gold field is about the area that's shown there in yellow, and that the richest area of it, the area where the most of all the gold was found, was about here. This is called the Mother Lode. And so those little red boxes, those are the places where the mining camps sprang up. And as you can see, they correspond very closely, as you'd expect, to the lode itself. Now, if you imagine a simplified version of the coast of California, I'm just going to do this for reasons of simplicity. Here's San Francisco Bay. One river is flowing south, and this is the Sacramento River, and eventually it flows into the San Francisco Bay, and it's parallel with the coast, about 100 miles inland. There's a coastal range here, and then a big central valley. And another river flowing north is the San Joaquin River, and it also eventually flows into San Francisco Bay. Okay? So this is the Central Valley. Then over here are some much higher mountains. What are they called, Ginny?
I don't know, actually. I've lived
There's
in
a clue.
The Sierra Nevada mountains.
That's right. It just means the snowy mountains. Yeah, Nevada, yeah. That's right. And then, as you can tell from the map, lots of rivers flow out of the Sierra Nevadas, and they join, and the northern ones join the Sacramento River, and the southern ones flow into the San Joaquin River. Okay? So that's a kind of schematic of the geography of California. And it's very important that you get a sense of what that looks like. All right? And of course, the gold is here, sort of in the foothills of the valleys. Okay? Now let's just first of all hear about how the news got back east. Alan, can you come up and read first of all? Have you all heard of William Sherman? William Tecumseh Sherman? He was a famous Union general during the Civil War. That's him on the right as a young man. And at this point he was a lieutenant in the US Army and witnessing what was happening when the gold was discovered. So here is Lieutenant Sherman. Right, off you go.
As the spring and summer of 1848 advanced, the reports came faster and faster from the gold mines at Sutter's Mill. Stories reached us of fabulous discoveries and spread through the land. Everyone was talking of gold, gold, until it assumed the character of a fever. Some of our soldiers began to desert. Citizens were fitting out trains of wagons and pack mules to go to the mines. We heard of men earning $50, $500, and thousands of dollars per day. And for a time, it seemed as though somebody would reach solid gold.
Great, thanks very much. That's right. So in other words, the news gets out, and here's an army officer reporting back to his seniors what's been going on. Not long after that, the president himself made a big speech. And as it happens, we've got the president here with us, James K. Polk. And so if you just look at the back sheet of the handout, everyone, you'll see what the president said. So this, again, this is just a few months after the initial discoveries were made by James Marshall.
It was known that mines of the precious metals existed to a considerable extent in California at the time of its acquisition. Recent discoveries render it probable that these mines are more extensive and valuable than was anticipated. The accounts of the abundance of gold in that territory are of such an extraordinary character as would scarcely command belief, were they not corroborated by the authentic reports of officers in the public service who have visited the mineral district and derived facts which they detail from personal observation. The explorations already made warrant the belief that the supply is very large, and that gold is found in various places in extensive districts of the country. It appears also from these reports that mines of quicksilver are being found in the vicinity of the gold region. One of them is now being worked and is believed to be among the most productive in the world. The effects produced by the discovery of these rich mineral deposits and the success which has attended the labors of those who have resorted to them have produced a surprising change in the state of affairs in California. Labor commands a most exorbitant price, and all other pursuits but that of the searching for the precious metals are abandoned. Nearly the whole of the male population of the country have gone to the gold district. Ships arriving on the coast are deserted by their crews, and their voyages suspended for want of sailors. Our commanding officer there entertains apprehensions that soldiers cannot be kept in the public service without a large increase of pay. Desertions in his command have become frequent, and he recommends that those who shall withstand the strong temptations and remain faithful should be rewarded. This abundance of gold and the all-engrossing pursuit of it have already caused in California an unprecedented rise in the price of the necessaries of life.
Great, thanks very much. So that's President Polk, and he's making this declaration back east about the way in which the economy of California is already being transformed. People are pouring in, and nobody wants to do any work except go and dig for gold. Ships arrive in San Francisco, the crews all desert because they want to go up to the gold diggings. I mean, psychologists are very interested in this. Gold fever suddenly sort of takes people over. And the curious thing about gold is that it isn't really particularly useful. I don't know if you've ever thought about this very much, but I mean, today it's possible in things like semiconductors, there are some uses for gold, and in heat shields on spaceships. But then it was useful mainly for decoration, and also sometimes as a unit of currency because it's very chemically inert. In other words, it doesn't rust. If you make coins out of iron, eventually they just rust away, whereas a gold coin persists. But it's not really useful. Nevertheless was incredibly valuable. It's one of those many things which have been so important to American history, like gold and tobacco, on which great fortunes were made, even though they weren't actually essential, worth thinking about. All right, now people started pouring into California from all over, and back east and even around the world, in England and in France and in Germany and in South America and even in China. There was an enormous amount of enthusiasm about finding ways to get to California, and lots of handbooks like this began to be published. You can see this one's published in Boston. An account of California and the wonderful gold regions with a description of the different routes to California, information about the country and the ancient and modern discoveries of gold. In other words, help for travellers on thinking about how they're actually going to get there. Now, one of the And there were essentially three ways of getting there, and what they had in common was that they were all incredibly difficult. By our standards, unbelievably difficult. This is 1849, so still another 20 years were going to pass before you could get there by railroad. The first railroads had been invented, but so far they were very short lines. All right? So now one of the ways of doing it was by going in a clipper ship. This is a new type of ship with a lot of sail and capable of sailing very fast. So one possibility was to sail from the east coast all the way down through the South Atlantic and then around Cape Horn. What's that like? Horrible, yeah? It's the stormiest waters in the entire world, where you're actually coming into the teeth of the roaring 40s, and it can take weeks to get around, and you can often get shipwrecked on the way. But that was one way of doing it, and lots of people tried that. And this is an ad for it. A ship called the California, with its commander, Henry Barber. Yeah? And in fact, you can see that what the artist has done here is implied that from the gold diggings you can actually see the coast, which isn't really true. So in other words, the artist rearranged the topography for that. That's one possibility. The second possibility was to go by steamship, instead of going all the way around the tip of South America, to sail from the east coast into the Caribbean, to the place where the crossing is narrowest, and then either at the place we now call Panama or a bit further north in Nicaragua, to actually go across by land, across the isthmus, the narrow part, and then take a second ship, which would also take you up to San Francisco. Now, the advantage of doing it that way was that the journey was a great deal shorter. But the disadvantage is that just about the best place in the world in those days to die of malaria or yellow fever was there. Yeah? This is an incredibly difficult place just to live, even going across it. A few years, in fact, 3 or 4 decades later, the people who'd successfully built the Suez Canal in Africa tried to build the first Panama Canal and failed because all the labour force died of these horrible tropical diseases. Yeah? So that was a risky business, but people were trying it anyway because the incentive was so great. For California direct, extraordinary inducements, Nicaragua, and that's the point. The quickest, cheapest and safest, that's what they claimed. Whether it's true is another matter. Now, the third way was to go on the overland trails, and of the 3 routes taken, this was the one which was done most frequently. As you know, from what we've said previously in the course, the Oregon Trail had really opened up in about 1843 or 44, so 5 or 6 years previous to this. And from trial and error, they'd worked out that the best way to do it was to start at Independence, Missouri, go up the Platte River, and then across onto the Sweetwater River, cross the Rockies at the lowest point at South Pass, then pick up the headwaters of the Snake River and go north until it meets the Columbia River, and then down the Columbia as far as Portland, where the Willamette River meets the Columbia, and that's where the great Oregon farmland was. So between 1843 and 49, lots of people had done that. Now, it was at this point that various cut-offs were established, particularly the California Trail, with a cut-off down here towards Sacramento itself. So this is approaching it overland rather than going by sea. But the Oregon Trail, I mean, intrinsically very difficult in itself. And if you then took the California Trail, it was even worse. Because by doing that, you'd have to go into northern Nevada to a place called the Humboldt Sink. Now, there's a river called the Humboldt River, which is usually a dry riverbed. It only has water in it for a few days of every year. Mostly it's just bone dry. So you have to cross this incredibly hot, arid, pitiless desert, and all along the way people died from various things. But to make matters even worse, you then had to cross the Sierra Nevada mountains themselves, and they're very, very formidable. It was harder crossing the Sierra Nevadas than it was crossing the Rockies. It's great skiing country today, but we live in softer times than they did. And already by then, one of the most famous incidents in the history of American cannibalism had taken place there. The Donner Party was a group of immigrants who set off from Independence, Missouri, took the California cutoff, were part way up the Sierra Nevada mountains when a very, very severe blizzard snowed them in. They weren't capable of going forward any further, but neither could they get down the mountains because the snow was too thick. Many of them died, and the survivors ate the bodies of their relatives who died in order to survive. And of course, news of this also spread very rapidly. So anyone who was going to the gold rush over the the so-called Donner route. It's the route taken today by Interstate 80. You still go that way if you cross the mountains. It's hard, but it's relatively the easiest way. Knew that this was the kind of territory they were crossing. And so very, very rapidly, between the first discoveries in mid-1848 and early 1849, something like 80,000 people poured into this area, the area around Sacramento and just upriver from there, coming by these various routes. And the migration carried on over the next 5 or 6 years. Now, here's something to think about that it's easy to forget. It was only in 1848 that California became part of the Republic. Yeah, until then, it had been part of Mexico. Most Americans probably didn't even know where it was. Yeah? Suddenly, it becomes part of America, and suddenly it turns out also to have this incredible abundance of wealth. How galling must it have been to Mexico? Not only had they lost the war, they hadn't noticed for the previous 350 years that they were sitting literally on a gold mine. It's one of these many historical ironies where it can prompt meditations about the nature of reality and the nature of good fortune too. All right, now we need to talk a little bit about rivers. Well, I said in doing this diagram that it's in the foothills of the Sierra Nevadas that most of the gold was found. In other words, it's in the place where rivers flowing rapidly downhill are beginning to flow out into the plains, or into the flatter land of the Central Valley. So if you imagine the same thing, that's a bird's eye view. Now think of it, looking at it from the side, it's something like this. If this is the Central Valley, and that's the high Sierras, the area where the gold was found was kind of this area. Now, why should that be? Anisha, tell us why you think it's found here.
Maybe because of the way the mineral deposits were with the geology of the area.
Well, it's connected with the river. I mean, the place where they started looking for gold was in the river itself.
Okay.
Yeah. So what happens to a river when it's flowing out of the mountains and onto lowland?
It deposits the sediment.
Yeah, it starts depositing things. That's right, it's carrying sediment. Why does it deposit it there?
Because that's the
lowest. That's the deposit zone.
Yeah, that's like the lowest part. So it, like when the water can't move, the sediment can't move through with the water, then it just gets left.
That's right. Well, and which carries more sediment, a fast-flowing river or a slow one?
Fast.
Yes, exactly. So this is the area where it starts to slow down. Yeah? The river starts to slow down, and as it does so, it starts to drop the sediment it's carrying. And does it first drop the heaviest or the lightest things?
The heaviest?
Yeah, such as?
Rocks.
In particular? Gold. Right. Gold's very, very dense. Okay. That's right. So in other words, fast-flowing rivers carry a lot of sediment, yeah? But as they slow down, as they flow down into the lowlands, they lose some of this energy and they begin to deposit their load. And they deposit the gold first because it's the heaviest element. That's right. And so that's why it's such a good place to dig. And sure enough, if you looked at that map with the red and yellow things, it was. Now, now look at this photograph. Can you see that the river is meandering? Yeah, it isn't flowing in a straight line. They hardly ever do. It's flowing in a curve. Kelly, when a river is flowing around curves, is the current fastest on the outside of the bend or the inside?
The outside.
The outside. Why?
I'm not quite sure I'm not quite sure why it flows faster on the outside.
Yeah. Well, you're absolutely right. It's the simplest thing in the world, actually. It's because the water flows in a straight line until something stops it. Yeah, it flows straight downhill until it hits the bank, and then it turns, and then it flows in a straight line until it gets stopped again. So what's happening all the time in the rivers is that the bends are tending to become more exaggerated. Again, if you've had a window seat in the plane and you've looked down, you can often see where the course of the river used to be, yeah, which isn't there any longer. Very often you have things called oxbows, which look like this. And you can see it more clearly from the air. And you think, oh yeah, it used to be there. It used to be a huge bend, but then eventually it was cut off and the river straightened itself. But then the process starts again. All right. So then think about what this means in terms of the deposit of gold. It means not only that in this transitional area coming out of the mountains, it also means that the very, very best place to look is on the inside of the bends, because that's where the current is flowing more slowly. And that means that's where it's going to be dropped. And you can actually see on the photograph here, there's a little beach, isn't there, on the inside of the bend, where the water's hardly flowing at all, and you can imagine going and paddling and looking across and seeing it flowing more rapidly. So the perfect place to stake a claim, if you were one of the 49ers, one of the California miners, was on the inside of the bend at the place where the river leveled out. And sure enough, that's where they found a lot of gold. Now, one of the great things about the early days of the California gold rush is that it was a very democratic kind of thing. Anybody could do it. You had to get there, which was hard, but once you were there, all you needed was a shovel and a pan. It's like a wok. An old pan for gold? Yeah, I mean, there's all sorts of places. You can do it up at Dahlonega, in fact. Right. Just like this miner is holding. Now, what you do is you shovel into the pan some of the sediment from the riverbank, and put in water, and then gradually swirl it around so that you make a suspension of the lighter particles with the water, and let that just flow over the sides of the pan, with the heavier particles staying behind. If you carry on doing it very gently and methodically, you need a lot of care and patience. Eventually what you're left with is a bed of gravel with gold flakes in it. You can actually pick out the flakes of gold. That's the way in which it was done. So it's a very, very low-tech business. But incidentally, when we look at the history of who got rich in the California gold rush, what we discover is that it was mainly the people, not who actually dug, but who sold shovels and who sold pans and who sold donkeys and who sold tents and who sold food. I mean, that was the way to make a fortune, because whether or not the diggers actually found the gold, you'd get paid for the provisions. And you could charge a very high price because the stuff had to come a long way. It was in incredibly high demand, and so you could get top price for the sale of it. And we've got lots of illustrations of people using very, very primitive recovery techniques, usually working in gangs of 5 or 6. Here's a slightly more sophisticated device. It's called a rocker. And what happens here is that a mixture of gravel and water is poured in at the top, and it filters down through a series of sieves, each one of which is a little bit finer than the one before. And you pour the water over, the coarser gravel gets caught on top, and then in the lower level down here, you have a piece of rough burlap sacking, or maybe an old bit of carpet, and the little particles of gold catch in the fabric. So after you've sluiced the water across it, again, you're left behind as it dries out with particles of gold that you can pick out. And this became the actual currency in the gold districts. Now, eventually, of course, it starts to occur to some people that if the gold is there, it must have come from further upstream. So doesn't it make sense to go upstream to actually find it? And of course, the answer was yes. And here's how that works. So back to the diagram of the hillside. You found lots of it just lying about in the water down here. That means that somewhere up here there's actually a vein of gold, or a vein of gold-bearing rock, which is exposed to the surface, and that as the water flows over it, it's being eroded bit at a time over the course of hundreds of thousands of years. The gold itself is formed deep in the earth under incredible high temperatures and pressures by a geological process we can't go into here. But then when you get tectonic thrust, sometimes you get the buckling of the rock strata, and it can bring to the surface one of these strata which originally was a long way below. That's why gold is usually found in mountain districts, because of the irregularities of the Earth's crust. All right? So let's imagine that this is where the gold vein is. So if you decide to look for the gold vein itself, here's how you do it. You go upstream and you test the water here, and then you go upstream again and test it here, and you go upstream again and test it here, and then you go upstream again and you test it here. Now, in each of these places, you find some gold, but less than you had down here because of the pace of the river. But of course, eventually you get to a place where you find none at all. Why do you find none? Because you've gone above the vein. Yeah? So that tells you, so then you do some much closer testing sort of here, and eventually you think, this is where it is. It's hardly ever self-evident. I mean, it just looks like rock, but then you can work out where it's come from. And then there's the possibility of digging out, or trying to dig out, the gold itself. It's very, very difficult to do, but that's the logical conclusion that the miners came to. Let's look for the origins of the gold itself. That's why we've got so many photos up here in the mountains. Edo, yeah, go ahead.
How do you spell vein?
Vein, V-E-I-N. Same as a blood vein.
Okay.
Yeah. It's called a vein or a drift. There's lots of miners' terminology, and depending on which mines you're in, there tends to be a different rhetoric to go with it. Now, all the techniques of digging for gold required access to water. And so, and again, another group of very entrepreneurial 49ers realized water supply was itself a highly lucrative business. That is, going to a place where there's a stream and diverting the stream to the place where people are digging, usually by building a flume. And you can see what the flume is, just a primitive above-ground canal, usually a wooden channel, which will guide the water to places where people are digging. Because, in other words, the very first strikes are here on the river, on the main part of the river. But eventually people start saying, well, look, for a long time the river flowed here. That's a great place to dig. But of course we can't do it if it's dried up unless we've got a water supply. But then the flume, you know, someone who's an entrepreneur is building a flume down to this area to help them do it. So high up in the Sierra Nevadas, lots of these very enterprising men were building flumes to divert the rivers, to bring it down to the gold-bearing country. And in this picture, you can actually see the process going on. There's a small stream here. They've built a very, very primitive rock dam, but it's good enough that they can then channel the water into the flume, which carries it off to the area where they're going to be exploring for the minerals. Then, of course, it occurs to somebody, if it's pretty good getting it from the side of the river, think how much better it's going to be if we actually dig into the bed of the river itself. How do we do that? Well, we can only do it by damming and diverting the river. But again, we've got, I mean, this is a period where lots of illustrators went to do pictures of what was going on. So we can actually reconstitute it pretty well. This is a place called Murderer's Bar, presumably because somebody was murdered there. And you can see that that's my deduction anyway. Right. And you can see that what's happened here is that they've built a dam across the river itself. Here we are in the foothills. And they've built a diversionary channel so that what was the bed of the river has now become dry, and then they can dig down into it and get up the sediment which has been accumulating there literally over hundreds of thousands of years. But there's a catch. Well, and you notice also that they've introduced water wheels here. As the flow of the river is narrowed, it gets faster. So you get a lot of energy which can turn these water wheels, and they're attached to winches which actually go up and down into the earth to bring up mechanically the stuff that's being produced. And there's a steam engine here. So, you know, there's some technology that's been brought in. But as you can imagine, this is all expensive. A guy with a shovel can't afford this. It's only people who've got capital who can do work like this. So, and very early on, already by 1851, 52, it's people with capital who are making money at mining, because they can do these big earth-shifting operations which are necessary to really make it pay. And so gradually what tends to happen is the people who'd come out hoping that they'd be independent gold diggers actually become employees of mining companies working for wages. Yeah, in projects like this. And they realised the value of going quite a long way down into the earth. So you can see here that it's literally becoming mining, but they're still mining into the gravel which is underneath the bed, or the old bed of the river itself. Now, it wasn't long after that before somebody invented this method, hydraulicking. This is an invention of the 1850s. They said, look, okay, the river has been gradually eroding the mountainside over the course of millions of years. Let's speed up the process by firing against the mountainside a very, very high-pressure jet of water to, in effect, accelerate the erosion process hundreds of times over. Yeah, don't let it happen gradually. Let it happen all at once. So, and again, it's a matter of getting a flume upstream and guiding the water down until you bring it into these, they're like big-scale fire hoses. Have you ever seen the fire hoses at work? You know, the incredible high pressure they have. It's strong enough that if you put your fingers in front, it'll break your fingers. Yeah? And then and you shoot it out of narrow gauge nozzles with great pressure against the mountainside. And this is when this washes down sediment, out of which it's then possible to gather the gold in the same way. hydraulicking. The very first environmental laws passed by the state of California were in the 1870s to ban this practice, because what it meant was that tons of debris was coming downstream and stifling the farms. Yeah, very bad from the farmer's point of view, but in the 50s and 60s and early 70s, the mining was more important than the farming. But then, when all these other methods have been tried and gradually exhausted, then it's a question of actually digging into the mountainside and trying to follow the vein into the interior of the mountain itself. And the name we give to that is hard rock mining, where what you're actually bringing out of the mine is an enormous quantity, mainly of quartzite, within which there are small elements of gold. And again, at first, little groups of fellas tried it, but bit by bit they were edged out by the people who got enough capital to do it on a large scale. So this is what the big mines looked like by the 1860s and 70s. And luckily by then the technology of photography was good enough, started in the 1830s and getting steadily better, that we've got pretty good pictures of what it looked like. So again, 49ers become mine labourers. Now here's what happens inside a working gold, a hard rock gold mine. You usually have teams of two working at a technique called double jacking. This is where one guy's holding a chisel against the rock face and the other one's hitting it with a sledgehammer. It needs a very high degree of trust among friends. Yeah? One guy holds the chisel, the other one hits it, turn it slightly, hit it again, turn it slightly, to dislodge the gravel. And over the course of an hour of hard hammering, you've cut a hole, maybe this deep. If you imagine that you're working against a rock face, which is more or less semicircular, you cut one there, and so on, all the way around. Then fill them with gunpowder, lead fuses to each one of them, light the fuses, retire to a safe distance, and then let them explode. And if you've done it right, that has if the holes are this deep, an arc of explosions will dislodge the rock in that arc, and when the dust and smoke have cleared, you can go in and clear out all that rock, bring it up to the surface, and then repeat the process again. Yeah? It's incredibly dangerous work. Right, for about, I think maybe right up to the present, being a miner is the job in which you're most likely to be killed at work. You can imagine that the roof can cave in, you can get caught by charges which didn't explode, which then sparks from a hammer will set off. Methane gas will sometimes explode. Sometimes there are suffocating gases that you can't breathe and you can die in the mine. They're horrible, horrible working environments. And of course in those days they didn't even have electric light. They just had smoky tallow candles, so the atmosphere was terrible. So in every way a very, very deplorable way of life. Gradually, improvements were developed. One was the invention of an improved explosive called nitroglycerin. It's a liquid explosive, more powerful than gunpowder, but also more volatile. If it gets too hot, it spontaneously explodes. We've got some very sad stories of that happening. Then the invention of drills in which high-pressure water is the power source instead of simply guys with hammers. The problem with those is they also created enormous great showers of dust, so that the miners tended to be breathing in a very dust-heavy atmosphere and tended to die young of silicosis and pneumoconiosis, mining-related diseases. Horrible way of life. Anyway, little underground railroads built so that you can load the ore onto wagons, take the wagons to the pit shaft, and then have them drawn up to the surface. Now, when the hard rock gets to the surface, then the question is, how do you get the gold out of it? It's no longer any good to use the panning techniques because the parts per million are very, very small. And there's not much gold and there's a lot of rock. Instead, you had to use what was called, well, the various names for it. This is a crusher. On the right here, you can see a water wheel. So you imagine that the fast-flowing water turns the wheel, and it's attached to this device, which is an axle bearing cams, and as the cams go past these rods, these are attached to great stamps, great heavy weights. So the ore itself is fed through here on a conveyor, and these devices stamp it to reduce it to powder. That's the way in which a stamping mill works. And then, next thing is to combine the powdered ore with mercury. Who's seen any mercury? It's a metal that's liquid at room temperature. Yeah, we now know it. This is another of these sources, another way in which you get poisoned at the gold mines. We know it's very, very toxic, that you mustn't work around mercury or mercury compounds because they're too dangerous. But that wasn't known at the time. Now, this reddish rock on the left here is called cinnabar, and that's mercury oxide. In the speech which Ramar read to us earlier on, he says, it appears from these reports that mines of quicksilver are found in the vicinity of the gold region. Quicksilver is another name for mercury, and so cinnabar mining becomes as important as gold mining because this is the standard process for separating the metal from the ore. What happens is that you mix the powdered ore with water to make a kind of sludge, and then you pour in mercury, and the mercury and the gold combine chemically. And they're very heavy, and so by sending it across gently sloping gradients, you'll cause this gold and mercury compound to fall to the bottom. Then you heat the whole thing, and because the mercury is already so volatile, it gets vaporized and driven off, and you're left behind with the gold. Yeah? Usually in a highly concentrated, pure form, so you can turn it almost straight away into gold bars. So that's the way it's done as a commercial mining operation. Now, I did want to show you this lovely, lovely photograph. Again, this is about 20 years after the first invention of photography, but it perfectly illustrates the point that Lieutenant Sherman made. This is San Francisco Bay in 1850. Ships would come in from all over the world, but very often they'd never set sail again because the crews all deserted. Everyone got there, thought, well, gold! They went off up to the hills. You know, there's gold in them hills, literally. And so this incredible photograph of the whole city, or of the whole harbour, I should say, with these abandoned ships. It's dramatic, isn't it? I mean, so much so that one of the things that shopkeepers started to do was to drag the ships up on land. You see, this one and this one, they've just converted them into stores because they're big containment areas. Ideal. Now, that's one thing, but there's other interesting things about it. There's a lot of good chromolithographs. That's this style of picture at the time. Shirley, tell us about this picture, if you would, please. And just wait for a second while the boom comes over to you.
You see a lot of people inside, and I can't...
Well, it says the bar of a gambling saloon.
Oh, so people are trading for gold, I think, or...
That's right, yeah. And what are you meant to be surprised by as a viewer? Look at the clothes.
Everyone's pretty well dressed.
No, it isn't well dressed. Who do you think these guys are?
Farmers.
No. What country do they come from? Right, look at the hats.
I can't really tell.
No. They're meant to be Chinese.
Okay.
Yeah. And how about these two?
Are they from another Asian country as well?
No, well, no, they're meant to be Mexican. In other words, what the artist is doing here is showing us the traditional dress of all the different groups of people who've come from different parts of the world. That's the idea of it. In other words, this really is America's very first multicultural environment, where suddenly there are people from China, Chile, Mexico, England, Switzerland, all sorts of people have gathered, and it's very unusual. People weren't used to that kind of thing. Who's this one? It's a stereotype. Yeah, Irish. It's the Irish drunk. Yeah, the idea is... Yeah, people come from all over the world, and when the Irish get here, what do? They get drunk. Yes, it's one of these old stereotypes. But, and again, here's an illustration of the artist's imagination. What's it like in Chinatown when suddenly a Chinatown develops in Sacramento? Chinese life, 3 exclamation points. You know, the idea is, whoa, how weird is that Chinese people are living here in America? That's what the artist's getting at. And similarly in this one, this is meant to be a horse market in Sonora. In the background, you can see the Miners' Saloon. So again, there's 2 Chinese men here, the Mexican here, the Anglo guy who's buying the horse, African-American over here. Yeah, well, people used to, Southerners would take their slaves to the gold mines. Yeah, a great concentration of people coming in from all over the place around the world. And the idea of pictures like this is to say, oh, what a weird world is that? Anyway, it's had the result of very, very rapidly populating what had previously been a very, very underpopulated place. Kelsey, can you come up and read us your passage? This is on the, it's above the President's speech in the handout. This is a historian writing about 40 years ago, a man called Robert Ahern, describing the way in which gold accelerated the process of American settlement.
The little grains of bright yellow metal through a bridgehead across the desert, established a front line of civilization along the Rocky Mountains, and drew men from the east, farther out onto the arid plains. The glittering prize lighted the way, illuminating the darkness of earlier obstacles, and convinced men that no matter how great the barriers, they could be surmounted. After the men came their baggage, both material and cultural. Freight wagons brought not only necessities but the trappings of civilization, printing presses, the refinement of books, and some art objects. The advance guard of prospectors, men, found money with which to buy, and out of their spending came roads, civic development, churches, schools, and above all, women. When the family unit came or was locally assembled, permanent assembly was normally assured. With the floating scum gone, those who were serious about the new land settled down to extract their own kind of gold, grain or cattle, and another section of the United States was commenced.
Great, thanks very much. Yeah, he makes the point there that normally, if you look at the history of how communities developed, they started out as agricultural and later on became urbanized as people gathered together in towns. But in the West, in these mining camps, it was the other way around. They started out as concentrations of people all in the same place, building these mining settlements. But then after the mines had played out, then gradually people began to disperse. So the farming population of California was an afterthought, even though in the long run it was going to prove more lucrative even than the mining had itself. So that's an example of the way in which the normal process of urbanization was reversed. For reasons of time, we've got to stop now. Next time, we'll talk about the origins of the history of the oil industry.